Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Training Tidbits podcast show. I'm your host, Ryan Cartledge from Animal Training Academy, and I'm really excited to be with you today for what's going to be part one of a two-part series talking with a good friend of mine and someone who has been a huge inspiration to me over the last couple of years. Before we introduce her, though, I just want to say a massive thank you for tuning in, and I'm speaking to you. That's right, you, listening to this podcast. This show is made with you in mind. In fact, it only exists because you listen to it. It exists to bring animal behavior management thought leaders right into your eardrums, car stereos, smartphones, computers, and wherever else you might be listening to this. There are also lots of people just like you who tune in every month. Zookeepers, dog trainers, vets, wildlife rehabbers, parrot lovers, cat lovers, bird nerds, reptile fiends, positive reinforcement horse trainers, fish trainers, and aquarium workers, and everyone that has anything to do with all animals of all kinds. And I'm blessed because some of you choose to write into me and tell me how this podcast has and is changing your and your animals' lives. This is my reinforcement. And you are part of this and part of the amazing Animal Training Academy community striving for excellence in the way we care for our animals and their welfare. On this note, and with that goal in mind, I ask you to help. If you enjoy the episode today, or if you have enjoyed past episodes, please share this information. Send it to your friends on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and or Facebook, wherever you hang out. These episodes are free and they're going to remain that way. And if you want to do your part in improving animal welfare all over the planet, then this is one small thing you can do. But let's move on to today's guest, one of the founders of the Shape of Enrichment, whom I had the pleasure of meeting at a workshop she conducted at Wellington Zoo right here in my hometown in 2014. I'm talking about the wonderful Valerie Hare. Val is currently the Chief Financial Officer and Workshop Coordinator for the Shape of Enrichment Incorporated. She's also worked as a research animal care supervisor at the Massachusetts General Hospital and zookeeper at San Diego Wild Animal Park, a behavioral research technician at the San Diego Zoo, and of course now as an enrichment consultant. Valerie has also served on the International Conference on Environmental Enrichment Committee since 1997 and served in the Bear Care Group Board of Directors between 2007 to 2014. She's a member of the Animal Behavior Management Alliance, the ABMA, and of various zookeeper associations from around the world. Val holds a bachelor's degree of science in biology with an emphasis on zoology from San Diego State University and an associate's degree as a veterinary technician from the State University of New York. It is without further ado and my great pleasure to welcome one Valerie here onto the show today. Hello, Valerie. How are you?
Hello, Ryan. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. And it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to introduce you onto this show. It's so great to have you here. And thank you so much for being willing to come on.
No problem. It's a bit early for you, isn't it?
Yeah, it is 8 a.m. here, but I've already been up for 3 hours. So that's okay. Hey, let's dive straight in today, Val, with our first question. I was wondering if we could learn a little bit more about your personal story / behavioral odyssey, and if you could share with us where you first started learning about and using enrichment, and maybe share a couple of stories from your early experience.
Okay. Well, I don't know, Ryan, you've probably heard me say this before. I frequently say that I'm getting pretty old, so I've been around long enough to do a lot of different things. And most everything that I've done has been animal related. I knew my whole life I was going to work with animals. With respect to enrichment, that probably started when I was working in the research facility back in the early 80s. My boss at the time, Don Gollitz, we had many discussions about how valid the research results were that came from the animals in our care if the animals were not living in a good environment, not living in good welfare. And this was genuinely before the time when a sort of a stress welfare connection had been made. So I always thought he was very forward thinking. And then some years later, I had moved 3,000 miles away and I worked in the zoo. And in the library, I encountered papers written by Dr. David Shepherdson and Hal Markowitz's book, Behavioral Enrichment in the Zoo. And I realized that all of those concerns that Don Gollitz and I had had those years earlier really were summed up by the concept of enrichment. And the kinds of things we were trying to do for the animals we were caring for really were enrichment. So I guess that's how I became involved in it. When I started doing enrichment as a consultant some years ago, one of my favorite stories was when I kind of got in a little bit of trouble trouble because the enrichment worked too well. I was working with the giant panda team at that point, and our goal for the male panda was to increase his foraging time. So one of the first things we tried was we put his 16 foliivore biscuits in a pile of alfalfa hay. Now, this was a big pile of hay. It was, in fact, an entire bale fluffed up. So it was probably 2 or 3 times the size of the panda. What was so fantastic about this enrichment is he got all 16 bickies out fairly quickly, but he didn't know there weren't any more because he could still smell the crumbs that were in the hay. And so he just kept pushing that hay around, looking for biscuits. And he literally spent hours doing that, which was fine until it was time for the keepers to go home. The rule is a keeper has to be on site if the panda is not locked up in the back. So one of the keepers had to stay and do some overtime before they could get him off exhibit and away from his big pile of hay. But they were pretty excited about that too, so I didn't get into much trouble.
What a great story. And I love hearing about where people first started and what I refer to as people's behavioral odysseys. And it sounds like in your odyssey, you started learning about this stuff before anyone was even calling it enrichment.
I think that's true. I mean, some people may have been using the term in the zoo world, but I wasn't in the zoo world. And even going back, the term really became well accepted in the early mid-'80s when Hal Markowitz's book came out. So Hal Markowitz's book, Behavioral Enrichment in the Zoo, is out of print, but you can often find, a secondhand copy on various online vendors. A lot of the examples in his book are, for the time, very high tech, and so they may not be currently the best ideas to copy, but the concepts of what was going on and how the thinking went, I think is what's so truly interesting and won't be affected by time. For a little bit more modern look at it, Rob Young's book, 2003, Environmental Enrichment for Captive Animals, which is still in print, is kind of a how-to, and it's really the only book of its kind out there.
Hey, awesome, and a fantastic resource for those people out there listening who want to dive a little bit deeper on everything we're going to cover in part 1 and part 2 of this podcast episode. And I love learning about where people started their journey. So thank you so much for sharing, Val. Let's take some steps forward now and talk about the shape of enrichment, what it is, how it got started, its mission, and the holistic approach that the shape of enrichment takes.
SHAPE really got its start in 1991 at the American Zoological Association conference in San Diego, California. David Shepardson gave a talk about enrichment, and he ended that talk with the comment that what we really needed was a way to share information about enrichment to keep us all from reinventing the wheel and also from repeating everyone else's mistakes. Unknown to each of us, both Karen and I were in the audience, and we independently thought, oh, hang on, I know how to do that. I can do that. I can start some kind of a newsletter to share information. And surprisingly, within a few minutes of each other, we both had approached separately Gary Priest, who was the newly minted San Diego Zoo's enrichment coordinator. And we had both approached him to ask for advice about getting something going and funding for this. And I will never forget his face. He just kind of laughed, smiled. He literally stepped backwards and said, Karen Worley, meet Valerie Hare. You two need to talk. And as they say, the rest is history. So it started as a partnership in 1991, and our first issue came out in 92. And in 96, we took it to an NGO, a nonprofit organization. David Shepardson, Karen, and I are the board of directors from the get-go. That hasn't changed. We're also the officers, except Margaret Hawkins from Sydney, Australia, is our secretary. So the mission statement at SHAPE has never changed since our inception in 91, and that is that the Shape of Enrichment is dedicated to promoting worldwide environmental enrichment efforts for captive animals. There's a lot of aspects to SHAPE that we use to promote this, and those do change over time. But currently, our biggest endeavors are the publication, which has now switched from a written, printed format to an online edited blog, the website, which is being redone as we speak, social media, and workshops. Amongst ourselves, our sort of working mission, if you will, is to interpret the knowledge that the folks who are researching enrichment and welfare learn from their science. And and taking that and experiences from around the world and interpreting it for animal caretakers who are out there on the front lines, just trying to do the best they can to provide better welfare for their animals.
Really impressive that that hasn't changed in 27 years, and a bit of serendipity.
Yes, it was meant to be. Karen and I laugh about this all the time. We would have been happy if it lived 5 years. The fact that we're over 25 just blows us away.
And can you tell us a little bit more about Karen?
I like to say I'm the goofy side of shape and she's the pro. She has a master's in literature. She's been a high school English teacher, and she's, for some years now, been the chief editor of Zoo News, which is the San Diego Zoological Society's members publication. And I don't even know how many subscribers they have, probably 500,000. I honestly don't know. She knows what she's doing. She's taught me a lot about publication, and I'm kind of the one who goes out and gets dirty, and she's the one that makes it all look good.
Sounds like a great partnership.
It is. She's now my best friend. My children grew up with her. She's the close friend of the parents that everybody wants to call her their aunt, you know? She's part of our family now.
I need to find myself a Karen.
Yeah, everybody needs a Karen.
So you mentioned the newsletter's been turned into a blog now?
Yes, and I am so woefully behind the times that that's about all I can tell you about it. If you go on our website, you actually can click and get there and see there's a couple of stories up. But it's, like I say, all of the attention right now is going towards redoing the website because it's kind of gotten hacked and broken up. And so it's taking all of the techno people's time.
And just for anyone listening, that's currently is, and it's going to stay, www.enrichment.org.
Yes. And you can go on there and read several things. It's just sometimes we can't get the more interactive stuff working, or we can't change some of the older files that are up there. But we're working on that. It'll be
awesome.
fixed.
I can't wait for that because it's such a great resource online. And because you've been going for so long, it's one of those things that always needs updating, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So very cool. And how much fun it must now be to look back over the last 25 plus years and contemplate what you have achieved. You know, I feel absolutely honored to have myself been a participant in one of your workshops a couple of years ago at Wellington Zoo. And I thought we would talk more about these specifically now. Can you tell us what's involved in a typical shape of enrichment workshop? I also am doing air quotes when I say typical, by the way. And how many of these have you and your colleagues done over that period? And I believe you just completed a pretty fun one just recently.
To be honest, we don't actually know how many we've done. And enough people are asking us that question that we have actually started trying to collect the data on that. We have a lot of regionals who hold workshops that I'm not personally involved in, and I haven't bothered keeping, I mean, I know about them, but I haven't kept any records. So we're currently canvassing all of our regionals to get that information available. I can tell you that I personally have done over 75 in 26 countries. And there's easily been 50 or more that I haven't personally been involved in. So we're well over 100. And our workshops range from about 18 or 20 people. The largest one we had was 84. So let's just go with the number 100 and maybe an average of 30 people. That's 3,000 people been through workshops in 26 countries. That's pretty cool. So there's been quite a few. And I'll tell you, you earlier made a comment about what you get out of doing what you do. And my life is really tied up in workshops and has been for quite a few years now. And what I get out of it is a chance to travel the world and meet just awesome people and work with really interesting animals I never even heard of before, some of them, and get to talk to people like you. So what's a typical workshop? Typical is definitely in air quotes because we tailor our workshops to the needs of the host and the people attending. There's a lot of discussion with the host in advance about what different modules would be appropriate for this group. Should we spend a lot of time on data collection? Should we talk more about welfare? Things like this. But each of what we call our full workshops, which ideally is at least 4 days in English, at least 4.5 if there's translation involved, there are some core curricula and activities that are always included. Let's see, for example, topics covered are always going to be goal-driven enrichment, holistic enrichment, introduction to animal welfare, enrichment for individuals, planning enrichment, assessing enrichment, and safety. That covers sort of the core curriculum in all of them. I know that you've mentioned in past casts our planning chart, and I can talk about that later if you like, but basically in our enrichment workshops, workshops, the goal is to give the attendees enough tools that they can go back to their institution and start and maintain an effective enrichment plan for each of the animals in their zoo or whatever institution they're at. So our activity is working in small groups. They actually work their way through the entire planning process from beginning to end. And that is the thing that's unique to our workshops and the one or two other people who have, with our permission, started to offer similar workshops.
Over 75 workshops, 26 countries. That's kind of like 3 workshops a year and 1 new country every year.
Well, no, because they started the first one was in 2000. So.
Right, so that's even more.
I am often gone from my home between 5 and 6 months of every year.
What a life.
Yeah, and it's winding down, right? And I have a very large carbon footprint and traveled over 100,000 miles on airplanes every year for, I don't know, the past 7 or 8 years. And this is my goal this year, is to not travel 100,000 miles or more on an airplane. Yeah, we've done a lot of succession planning, and the very talented young man, Mark Kingston Jones from the UK, who's actually been helping me as workshop coordinator and primary instructor for some years now. And as I wind down, he's picking up the slack. The workshops will continue. We believe that all captive animals really deserve to live in the best welfare conditions that are reasonably possible. We work with a lot of different taxonomic groups in our workshops. We try very hard to certainly cover the classic, primates, carnivores, but we try very hard to get birds, herps, fish, and even some inverts into as many workshops as possible. And you alluded to the fact that we just did a kind of interesting one last month, a couple of weeks ago, in Brighton in the UK at a sea life center, which is an aquarium. They have several sites, and this workshop was all aquatics only. So fish and inverts, basically. We worked with, there was a herp. We worked with a pair of green turtles. The goal that group had was to provide some rubbing opportunities for scoot maintenance. We worked with sharks and rays, 3 different species of sharks and 1 ray. And the goal there was to distribute feeding opportunities at all levels of the tank vertically as well as across the tank. And we worked with seahorses. And those animals, all of the, I call them perching, but I think more accurate is anchoring points in their enclosure, were the same texture and very similar diameter. So the group had a goal to provide a wide array of perching opportunities and see what they sort of gravitated towards. And also, apparently seahorses can't really store their food inside, so they have to eat kind of continuously. And this is a problem for the keepers because they need to be providing food over long periods of time. So the goal was to come up with some low-tech feeding devices to dispense food over time. And the last group, which was probably my favorite, was the spiny lobsters. They had 26 of them in a tank that they knew were too many, and they were working very hard on fixing that. But in the short term, we thought it would be a good exercise for the group to figure out ways to feed the spiny lobsters to reduce aggression during feeding, which is a very common enrichment goal. So that was a lot of fun. Mark and we learned a lot about how aquarium folks look at taking care of their animals. They really are much more environmentally oriented than most of the zoo people. And that was very interesting for us. And truly exciting for us is that we've seen that several of the people who have gone to the workshop have already, within the last couple of weeks, posted videos of enrichment that they've done since they got home to their institution. So that's pretty exciting to see them actually taking it on board and being excited about it.
There's your reinforcement.
Absolutely. That and the travel.
Hey, you mentioned a bunch of goals in there, which is a part of what I learned at your workshops that I really took away and really love about the shape process. And the other thing you mentioned there, which I wanted to touch on a little bit earlier, and it kind of skipped both of our minds, was the holistic approach or holistic goals that you mentioned. Can you just talk a little bit more about that quickly?
Quickly, or for as many hours as you like.
Days, months, whatever.
Yeah, basically you have to go back to the enrichment definition, I think. And without quoting the actual definition, there's really 3 key points to remember. in there. The first is that we're going to make a change to the environment, the animal's environment. Next, because of that change, the animal will have a behavioral opportunity. And finally, because of that behavioral opportunity, the animal's welfare will be enhanced. And this is why we always include welfare in our workshops, because by definition, enrichment must enhance or at least not negatively impact an animal's welfare in order to be considered enrichment. Okay. So the first point there is we're going to make a change to the environment. Great. What do we mean by the environment? I'm one of those people that likes to break things down into categories. It helps me organize my thoughts in my brain. And so we've done the same thing with the environment. We consider 5 categories, and they are social, cognitive, physical habitat, sensory, and food. And each of them have subcategories that we spend a lot of time going over in the workshops and giving examples of each. I found over the years, this has worked well for us. We've never really needed to change them. And if one considers all 5 of those categories, you are being fairly holistic. You're addressing any part of the environment that the animal can experience. These categories, by the way, are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, some of the best enrichments will fall into all 5 of them at the same time. The categories are also not of equal importance to any given animal, and that makes things a little bit trickier. But if you think about what does a tiger need and want in its environment compared to what does a seahorse need and want in its environment, each of those categories is going to have a certain value to that animal, and they're not going to be the same. Okay. By the way, we use 5 categories because it works for us. Okay. The motto of our workshops is whatever works for you. If you like 3 categories, use 3 categories. If you like 37 categories, use 37 categories. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that you're being holistic and you're actually covering all aspects of the animal's environment inside the enclosure and out. The other thing I find very helpful about those categories is when I'm scheduling enrichment, I actually create my schedule by category. So for a tiger that I know sensory enrichment is very important, sensory enrichment will appear on the schedule more often than cognitive enrichment might.
2 more things just before we move on. 1, someone listens to this podcast and they're interested in organizing a workshop. How do they do that?
Send either Mark or I an email. There's actually a section on the website where you can do that. You can send one to me and I'll make sure it gets to whoever the right person is. We'll get back to you, find out what you're interested in, figure out which are the best instructors, what availability is, get you scheduled, and work it from there.
And it's www.enrichment.org, and you can navigate to contact forms on that page.
Yes, and if there's any problem with that, the generic email for all things SHAPE is shape, SHAPE, at enrichment.org.
Perfect. And having been part of the workshop process, I can attest to the involvement from you beforehand, and it was a lot of fun. I remember back in 2014, I think it was, me, you and Sarah, past podcast guest, jumping on Skype and organising everything before you got to Wellington, New Zealand. And I just thought I'd share something fun with you, Val. Just before we go on, I had a report from Wellington Zoo the other day. I don't know if you remember, this was an indirect report. It came from someone else who was speaking to someone at the zoo. Don't know if you remember the climbing frame type enrichment item we made for the meerkats.
Oh, yes.
That was rediscovered.
Somebody found it stuck away somewhere?
Just a few weeks previous to this conversation. Someone told me that the other day, so I thought you might like to hear that.
That's pretty cool. 3 years later.
It's still in use.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So cool. And if you listening get an opportunity to attend one of these workshops, make sure you do. If you're like me, it will change your life and how you look at animals' behavior. Now, moving on, obviously my business is called Animal Training Academy. And as the name suggests, there is a big focus on animal training. And I love that for the audience of this podcast, we're getting an opportunity to learn more about enrichment, because to me, it's all tied together. And I know you recognize this as well. And you identify 3 big areas to managing animal behavior. These are training, enrichment, and the other one is problem solving, which I think is just great. Can you talk about this view of managing behavior and dive a little bit deeper into the problem solving side of things for us?
Okay. Well, the concept of behavior management was formalized by Gail Lowley and Tim Desmond of Active Environments. And I think that was trotted out in the late 90s. I know I encountered it in 99, and I think maybe it was a couple years old by then. And we usually do mention enrichment first because that was the first management tool that was being used in captivity. And if you think about it, enrichments have been around for, frankly, as long as we've had captive animals. And that big wave of behavioral management, the enrichment portion, really started in Europe and took off there. And then, as you say, training, which the US kind of, especially with Skinner, when B.F. Skinner came along, the US really sort of embraced that. And actually, for quite a while, it was almost as if there was a war between the two over which one was better. But I think people have realized now that they're both equally important and powerful management tools. And then the final one, problem solving, which also is a process that was developed by Tim and Gail of Active Environments. And we have been using this method for many, many years. All of our processes that we teach are based on scientific method. And this one clearly is. In a nutshell, what I love about this is it removes personal biases and it equalizes all of the humans involved in the equation. And the focus is on actually identifying and the cause of whatever the behavioral problem is. And once you know the cause, then of course, solutions are much easier to find. This process gets you to a solution that, solutions that are very likely to work to solve your problem in, I believe, the most efficient and effective way. And that's why we love it so much at Shape. There are 6 steps that we use for this process that Tim and Gail created. The first is to identify what the problem is very succinctly. My bear stereotypes or whatever it is. The second is to get information. This is the most overlooked and yet the most important part of the whole process. Learn all the information you can. Everything about the bear's environment, the bear's daily life, the bear's diet, its interaction with the keepers, what happens with visitors, what does a stereotypy look like, how often does it occur, when does it occur, does it occur in a certain part of the enclosure, is it affected by time of day or whatever. Any little bit of information that is available should come out. Once you have finished that bit, and really sometimes I feel like we're, to use the expression, beating a dead horse, trying to get more information out of people. Once you've done that bit, the next third step is to come up with some hypotheses, and that is plural. It's not a point of trying to pick one. Oftentimes, a behavioral problem is occurring because there's actually a combination of things going on. So identify any hypothesis as to the cause of this problem that you can come up with and keep track of them all. The bear was hand raised. The food truck drives by that part of the enclosure every day at 3:00. We got a new keeper on. This keeper wears a new perfume. Whatever seems even remotely possible to be causing the problem, write it down. The fourth step is to then create solutions for each and every one of those hypotheses. And you may get a very wide array of different things to try. And that's fine, because again, it could be a combination. Fifth step is to try it. Try as many of those things as you can and see if the problem goes away. If it does, and you wanted to know what caused the problem, well, that's fine. You can begin removing some of the solutions and see if the problem comes back. But all the time you're doing that research, the animal's living in better welfare. So I'm a big proponent of do everything, get the problem solved, and then you can take your time to sort out what the actual cause was, if that's important to know. And then the last thing is to assess, did the problem get solved? And if it did, then great, the problem's solved. If not, you're probably going to want to go back to step number 2, gathering information, because we usually find that some key piece of information was missing.
Hey, thanks so much for that, Val. And I really like the scientific approach to this. And you said equalizing human involvement. I thought that was a cool way of looking at it. And I like that you're forming hypotheses. You're not just coming up with a conclusion and kind of seeing what sticks and going with that. And just to recover what you said at the end there, so your approach is to kind of come up with a bunch of solutions and to implement all of them rather than kind of just try to do one at a time and figure out which one's having the most impact?
That is the way I prefer. You want to implement as many as are reasonable to do at once. I mean, it is clearly possible to change too many things in the enclosure at once and have a negative impact on the animals. So you have to be a little sane about it. But yeah, I like to very quickly get as many of those solutions tried and tested as possible, because researchers like to do them one at a time, because that way, when you find the solution, you know what it is. And that's a good, solid research model. But the problem in this case is the reason you're looking into this is the animal is having a problem. And that problem is most likely an indicator of poor welfare. So the whole time the research is grinding through one by one, a month at a time on each idea, that animal's living in impoverished welfare state. Whereas if you try and, we say, blitzkrieg the ideas and get a lot of them out there and just get it stopped, get the welfare enhanced and solve the problem. And then if one not wants to know what the actual problem was or what combination of causes were, then fine, you can go back and tweak that. But as I said, while you're spending the year or whatever to do that research, the animal's living in better welfare. And that's really the goal of everything we do with enrichment.
Really important. And I'm glad that we got to talk about this today. We'll move on and talk about this other area we wanted to address today. And that is, over this 25 plus year period, Shape's really developed a process. And the information you present is process orientated. Two kind of core ideas or components of what you do. And we've briefly mentioned one of them today, and kind of we spent a bit of time going over the 5 categories. But the other one is the planning chart. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit more about your Shape of Enrichment planning chart?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually glad you asked that, because I think this is the core behind everything we do with enrichment. It not only Shape, but as I said before, Shape works very hard to sort of interpret and make practical the information that we get from the researchers, from the scientists. And most people agree, nowadays you'd be hard to find an exception, that all enrichment should be goal-oriented, period. And that implies then that based on what your goal is, your enrichment is going to be different. And of course, we find that to be true. So basically what a large group of people did was turn this into, again, another planning chart that follows scientific method. And basically you need to learn about your animal and set a goal for your enrichment. I've mentioned some already. Decrease aggression during foraging, increase enclosure usage. It's endless. The types of goals we have out there are endless. In fact, at Shape, some years ago, classified, once again, here's those categories I like, classified enrichment goals into sort of 3 categories. One is behavioral, the obvious one. For example, we want to reduce pacing. The second category is biological. We want to increase physical fitness or even increase milk production, right, in a farm cow. And the third is what we call logistics. And that's things like having the animal be more visible to the public or helping them to shift when you need them to, protecting the shade tree that's in the enclosure from being damaged, these kinds of things. So once you've identified your goal, the next step is to get together a group of people, as wide a variety of people as possible who know the animal and or the facility at all, and do some brainstorming. And I think you've covered this in other casts, but basically brainstorming it's a human creative process, and you just throw out ideas. Somebody writes them down, and you never ever evaluate during brainstorming, because that kills everybody's creativity. You never comment on an idea that somebody throws out there. You just write it down and move on to the next idea. At the end of brainstorming, you'll have a list of possible ideas for enrichment. And at that point, you're going to look at reality. What's possible, what's reasonable, and what's pie in the sky stuff. And so ultimately what you're doing is you're looking at those criteria, those limitations, and splitting your one list of ideas into 2. What we call finalists, which is a list of ideas that are doable, and alternates, which is a list of ideas that at the moment are not feasible for whatever reason. Never throw your alternate list away. I'll come back to that. I have a good story for that if you have time. And then you're going to take your list of finalists, go through an approval process. If you don't have one at your facility, I recommend that you at least get a coworker to look over everything. Different people see different things. And especially with respect to safety issues, it's a good idea to have several people look at an idea. Once an idea is approved, you're going to build a prototype considering safety, and then you're going to give it to the animal, test it. And as long as you're testing, you're going to be standing out there watching anything new just for safety. So you're going to observe what's going on and record something. And from those notations, you're going to evaluate your enrichment. And really, your question you're asking in your evaluation is, did I or did I not meet my goal? That's it. If your goal was to increase enclosure usage, did this enrichment increase enclosure usage? Period. It's that simple. If you've met your goal, great. Then you now have an idea that's pre-approved, designed, and tested, and ready to go. There's nothing else you have to do except decide how often you're going to give it. If you did not meet your goal, have another go at it. And like I said, alternates list. The alternates list can be a treasure trove of ideas. One of my favorite examples is when I was working as an enrichment consultant for elephant department. In our brainstorming, the week before our meeting, a local animal rights activist woman, who we shall call Sally, had really attacked the elephant keepers in the press, in the local news. And she felt that the keepers didn't care for their animals because they were keeping them in captivity. Not surprisingly, they were a little, upset about this. And in our brainstorming, one of the keepers threw out there, I know, let's get a giant hamster ball, put Sally in it, put it out in the middle of the elephant yard, and let the elephants kick her around for a while. And of course, everybody laughed, but I was scribe, so I wrote the idea down, knowing full well that we're never going to get Sally in a hamster ball out in the middle of the elephant enclosure. But that's okay. Ultimately, after some time, we did come back to that idea. And what can we do with this idea to make it doable? And through a lot of revision and a lot of discussion, we actually wound up creating what we call an elephant feeder ball, which is a large, it's over 1 meter in diameter. It's a 20-side dodecahedron, I think is the right shape for it. It's made out of 1/4-inch steel, weighs about, in kilos, it's probably close to 175 kilos, maybe a little more. And it has 4 holes in it. So the alfalfa pellets are put in through a hinge door, and the ball is put out in the yard for the elephants to push around. And it's too big for them to pick up and throw because they can't wrap their trunks around it. It's too large. And they went from spending about 30 seconds eating their 1 scoop of alfalfa pellets to spending an hour and a half getting the pellets out of this ball. Absolutely fantastic. And we made 2 of them. I believe that was in 1994, and they're both still in use today. They've moved around. They get shifted every couple of years. There's, I think, 3 different places where the zoo has elephants, so they move them around. I've also been to other zoos where I've been in the back of the elephant areas and seen them sitting there, in Denmark, and just one in Sumatra, I think, and just all over the world. So really stupid brainstorm. Sally and a hamster ball actually turned out to be one of the best feeding enrichments we ever have come up with for elephants. And that's a true story.
And I love that story because one of my big takeaways from attending the workshop in 2014 was your brainstorming technique and the power of that. One of the biggest challenges I think a lot of people find is coming up with new ideas. So your never say no approach, it works and it's powerful.
It really does work. It's amazing. We've been using this process, this whole planning process. Well, we started using it in consulting before the first workshop. So we've used it in every workshop since 2000, all over the world. It works. It works in any situation, in any facility, and with any species. That's what's so brilliant about it. And that's why we teach processes, because they're absolutely flexible to work in whatever way works for you.
So cool. And such useful information. And for anyone that wants to learn even more about this stuff, you've got the SHAPE website. And I'll also link to the episodes in the podcast write-up we did with Sarah Van Herp from Wellington Zoo, who attended that workshop with me in 2014. And she went through the planning chart as well. And Sarah talked about it with a bunch of examples. Val, we are sadly nearly at the end of part 1 of this episode. But before we reach the end, we still have one of my favorite parts of the podcast show, and that is story time. Could you please look back through your career? And I know with all of your experiences, this was a challenging one to answer, but can you pick 2 or 3 stories to share with us now and some of the important lessons that you learned from them?
That is a tough question, as you can imagine, in 17 years, over 75 workshops with all these different taxonomic groups. It's been an amazing journey, absolutely amazing. Animals never cease to amaze me. Well, I already told you about working with spiny lobster. That's kind of an unusual taxonomic group. Let's see. How about the anaconda that we gave a cognitive challenge to? People don't think of cognition as a way to go with a snake. So one group in Oakland workshop in California here, we had a yellow anaconda, and their goal was to provide a cognitive challenge, not just a new experience, but a genuine problem to solve. And lo and behold, they succeeded. What they did was they identified the most important aspect of the enclosure to the anaconda, which was the pool of water, and they restricted access to it by placing a heavy piece of construction plywood over the pool. They cut away a corner of the plywood so the snake would be able to get in that way, and then they placed a plastic trash bin cover over that access. So when she came out, she had to figure out how to get in the pool. And she didn't do it in the time that we watched, but somebody went back and checked an hour later, and sure enough, she had moved the cover aside and was in her pool. I'm sure there was a lot of trial and error, but hey, that's involved in cognition, so that's fine. Oh, another one that's great for how important a goal is in South Africa. We did this workshop, and there was a marabou stork who had been hand-raised at the sanctuary, and he was old enough now to be eating on his own, but he wouldn't. He would not eat unless he was hand-fed by the owner and his neck was rubbed the way people do. So laughingly, she said that's what she wanted us to do for enrichment, was to get him to eat on his own. And we didn't have high expectations during the course of the workshop, but much to my amazement, they literally solved the problem that day. They did a couple of different things. Probably the most unusual one was they cut strips of meat that he liked and tacked them up on a board so that he could only reach them by lifting his head up a little bit. And the first few he reached, he pulled off the board and then dropped on the ground. But we waited, and after a bit, he pulled one off the board and popped it in the back of his mouth and swallowed it. And lo and behold, he went through the rest of the board that way. And from that moment on, he was eating on his own. So you just never know what's going to work. I liked what you said before. Never say never. Keep trying. But I think my favorite animals will still surprise me story. I'm a carnivore guy. That's where most of my history is. And we were working with a captive serval, and they were a bit overweight. So we were trying to get them doing some exercise. And we took a small plastic little kids swimming pool, and we put a couple of balls in it. I can't remember if they were like boomer balls, small boomer balls, or tennis balls, but we put 2 balls in it, and he had a blast. He was in that dry kiddie pool, no water. He was in there smashing those balls around in circles around the pool for the longest time. And we were all videotaping and photographing like crazy. And one of the balls popped out, and he kind of looked, and he just kept playing with the other ball. And the second ball popped out, and he kind of looked, and he jumped out of the pool and stood there looking around. And we all turned our cameras off because we figured he was done. He was going to walk away. No, he picked up one ball in his forepaws and popped it back in the pool. And then he picked up the second ball with his forepaws and popped it into the pool. And then he jumped back in the pool and kept playing with them again. So, like I say, animals will surprise you no matter how long you've been working with them. Your animals will surprise you.
I love that. Such amazing stories. There's a very good reason that I love this part of the podcast. Hey, thank you so much for sharing, Val. As mentioned, that does unfortunately bring us to the end of part 1. Part 2 will be in all of you listening out there's eardrums very soon. Before we wrap up, though, from myself and on behalf of everyone listening, Val, a galaxy full of Animal Training Academy gratitude to you today for recording part 1 of me.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.
So much fun. And I hope that you out there listening enjoyed that as much as we enjoyed making it. As mentioned at the start of the episode, if you want to assist with spreading the word about best practice animal training care and enrichment, then you can do so by sharing this episode. And one really easy way to do this, if you're listening to it from a podcast app on your mobile device or smartphone, there should be 3 little dots next to the title of the episode. Now, this might change slightly between devices and depending upon what app you are using, but if you click on this, there will be an option to share the episode, and then you can choose Facebook or email or however you want to share it, and it's done. Really simple. It'll take you 30 seconds. If you could do that, that would be super. That's it for this episode, though. We will wrap it up there, and thanks so much for listening. Live long and prosper, and we'll see you next time.